Okay, good morning everybody. Today's daf is daf Zayin in Masekhet Shabbat. We're going to start on Vav, Amud Bet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom. Going back to something that was discussed before. Now, as we've already said, some of this material is rather challenging. But this stuff is not quite as much of a complex and mind-stretching one as the prior two, so don't worry. So anyway, we discussed previously a list that the Gemara brought from a Baraita that told us what is the definition or what are some examples of what we call a Reshut HaYachid Gemara and Reshut HaRabim Gemara. Complete Reshut HaRabim or complete Reshut HaYachid, private and public domains. And it talked also about a Carmelit. And it said, a Yam, Bik'ah, Ve'istavanit, Ve'akarmelit. That there are 4 things that it said in the Baraita. Oceans, a valley, and Istavanit, which is a place where people would sit to sell their wares, like little stands in in the public domain, but it was a stand for selling. And in that area where the person was, had their own little area, that would be considered a karmelit, because it's not really for thoroughfare purposes, because you would go in there, but it's not a thoroughfare, so it's not considered a public domain. And then it said Karmelit and the Karmelit. So later the Gemara is going to say that these are all Karmelit, because what Karmelit is, we know that there are 4 reshuyot, there are 4 basic areas that are significant on Shabbat. The obvious ones are Reshut HaRabim and Reshut HaYachid, private domain and public domain, which one is not allowed to carry from private to public, or from public to private, or to carry 4 amot in a public domain. Private and public domain are defined essentially by physical characteristics, that a private domain is an enclosed place, and a public domain is a place that's open, but also is a place that's used by the public. So the public domain has that additional factor that it has to be used by the public in order to render it a public domain. Rabbinically, there's a similar idea for a private domain, as we're going to see in just a minute. But a karmelit is something which is neither here nor there. So it doesn't fit the parameters of a public domain, and it doesn't fit the parameters of a private domain. So for instance, a yam, when it comes to the ocean, it's not a thoroughfare. It's not a place that people are passing through easily. People could go swimming, or they could go on boats, but it's not a thoroughfare. Or a plain, or a valley or plain. These are not areas where people traverse normally, or going. It's not a place where that you would consider a thoroughfare. It's a plain in the middle of somewhere in the Midwest or something like that. So yeah, it's open to people to come and walk around, but it's not a thoroughfare. It's not populated with throngs of people.
But the road that goes through a plain is.
Yeah, a road would be different, but we're just talking about the plain.
And itself. Also, never the Gemara brings the 600,000.
No, it doesn't mention that anywhere. It doesn't mention that anywhere.
None of that mentioned.
It does make mention of the idea of being like the midbar.
Where everybody was.
Yeah, but it doesn't talk about
600,000.
No, it doesn't talk about that. Now, so Amar Mar, the master said, "Aval yamu bikavia histavanit v'karmelit enan lo kirshut yachid lo kirshut rabim." So one of the examples given of a karmelit, something which is not a private domain because it's not walled, and it's not a public domain because it's not used as a thoroughfare. It's not used as a main public area. So it's called a karmelit, really. A karmelit is the rabbinic term for a place that doesn't fall into either category. And if something doesn't fall into either category, so biblically speaking, it's like parav, okay? You could really carry from a private domain into it. You could really carry from it to a public domain. You could really walk around inside it for amot carrying things. But rabbinically, because it's indistinguishable from a public domain, really, because it doesn't have the feature of enclosure. So we treat it with stringencies of a public domain. And we also treat it with certain stringencies of a private domain as well.
Is that the Arab? Is that what the Arab is about?
Well, the idea is that,
it's open?
In theory, yeah. That's in theory how it works, yeah. So in this Baraita it said that the bik'ah, the plain, is not a Reshut HaYachid or a Reshut HaRabim. Vatnan, but we learned in a Mishnah to the contrary of this. Ha-bik'ah bimot hachama, that a plain during the summertime, Reshut HaYachid the Shabbat, Reshut HaRabim the Tum'ah. It's a Reshut HaYachid with regard to Shabbat, because in the summertime things have grown and they make it really like a private area. We're talking here about a plain where people plant things. So since now there are crops that have grown in this plain during the summertime, people don't walk in there. So it's really considered a private domain during the summertime. However, but with regard to tum'ah, with regard to impurity, it's a public domain. What is the laws of impurity? So basically, these are derived from the sotah. The sotah is not allowed to seclude herself with a man who is not her husband, and if she does, that's when she finds herself in trouble with the whole sotah ordeal. Now, the sotah, there, the definition of Reshut HaRabim and Reshut HaYachid, of course, is going to be established based on privacy. Where would you go to seclude yourself with an illicit paramour? Okay? For lack of a better term. So, going into a field, you might say that the field is like a Reshut HaYachid, it's like a private domain with regard to Shabbat, because, it's set off from the road, it's enclosed because it's got the crops lining it all around, and people don't walk through there. So it's like a Reshut HaYachid. But would you go in there to do something that you were afraid being caught? No, because sometimes people walk in there. It's not exactly a locked door. It's a place that people can get to. So that's why it's a Reshut HaRabim for Tumah. B'moteg Yeshamim, Reshut HaYachid, Lekan U'Lechan. And during the winter time, it's a Reshut HaYachid for everybody. Why? Because it's so basically muddy and wet during the winter time, and they've just planted, and it's just nobody will ever walk in there during the winter time. So therefore, it would be considered a private domain, even for somebody who wanted to go do something illicit, because nobody would ever walk in there during the wintertime. But the point is that it categorizes the bik'ah, the plain, as either being a private domain or a public domain. It doesn't say it's neither a private domain or a public domain. So Amar Ula Ula says, Leolam Karmelit Tavya. Really, the plain is always a Karmelit, meaning it's neither one. However, why does this Mishnah refer to it as a Reshut HaYachid? Because it's not a Reshut HaRabim. Because it's not a public domain. So we call it a private domain. But really, technically, when it says it's a Reshut HaYachid for Shabbat, it doesn't really mean it's a Reshut HaYachid for Shabbat, it's a private domain. It means it's not a public domain. And the only purpose here was to contrast the laws of Tum'ah, the laws of purity and impurity, and the laws of Shabbat. So being technical about whether it's a Carmelit or it's a private domain, it didn't go into that. It's just saying it's not a public domain at certain times. Now, the laws of Tum'ah have, the issue of a public or private domain is relevant more generally than the sotah. Even though we learn out the idea of a distinction between private and public from the case of the sotah, actually the law is always applicable. Because whenever you have a doubt about tum'ah of any kind, if it's in a public domain, we treat it leniently. If it's in a private domain, we treat it stringently. And we get this from the case of the sotah. Because in the case of a sotah, when she secludes herself, that's when we consider it stringent. And when she's in public with the person, that's when we don't. So we apply the same rule.
It wouldn't be a Carmelite. The courtyard.
Well, it's enclosed.
It's enclosed, but it's public. In other words,
sure. Well, that's why you have something called an eruv tichum. Well, called an eruv chatzerot, eruv chatzerot, which we learned about in Masekhet Eruvin.
Right.
That's the next Masechet.
But going by this criteria, a courtyard wouldn't
qualify for tum'ah for sure. For tum'ah, yeah, definitely not. Okay, so that's Ulat resolves this. He says there's no contradiction. Our Braita was speaking technically and saying it's a Carmelit. This Mishnah is speaking about what isn't a Reshut HaRabim. So it's not that it's really a Reshut HaYachid, it's really a private domain. It's just that it's not a public domain. Rav Ashi says, now we move to Amud Aleph, Zayin Amud Aleph, it's a good place to catch up. What are we talking about here? A plain that is fenced around, or has walls. That's why the Mishnah says it's a private domain. So our Braita is talking about a plain that is open. That's why it calls it a Carmelit, just like the ocean, it's open. But when the plain is fenced in or enclosed, now it's a Reshut HaYachid. That's what the Mishnah was talking about, where there's actually a fence. Okay, so even there with a fence, since people sometimes jump the fence or they go in, it could sometimes still be considered a public place for certain purposes. But it's fenced around, so it's considered a Reshut HaYachid on Shabbat. Our Braita that said that it's considered a Carmelit, that it's not private for Shabbat purposes, is it talking about a plain that's not enclosed? Okay, so that's what Rav Ashi says. Ve'chi ha'de'amar Ula amar Rabbi Yochanan, like something else that Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And it's very ironic because he's disagreeing with Ula, but he's quoting from Ula's teaching about this. Because Ula was the one who said that we're talking that really a plain is always a Carmelit. And we're not talking about an enclosed one that has a fence around it. We're talking about an open one. And yet really it's a Carmelit. But he's saying, no, it's like something that Ula himself said in another context. That a karpef yoter mibet satayim shelo hukaf ladira va'afilu kur va'afilu kurayim. That if you were to have these are basically enclosed, very large enclosed areas that instead of being enclosed for the purposes of living or dwelling, they're enclosed for other purposes. For instance, for planting certain things in there, or for storing certain things, or whatever it might be. But they're not enclosed for the purposes of dira. Now, they're very large, like storehouses. That were enclosed for other purposes. So in that case, he's saying even if it's more than a bet satayim, if it's more than the area where you would plant a certain amount of grain. Okay, they say it's 70 amot square, basically, I think is the measure. Even if it's a place where you would, for a kur or a kurayim, in other words, it's trying to say that even a very large area, okay, hazorek letocho chayav, no matter how large it is. In other words, you might say at a certain point it's gigantic. It's for a kur or a kurayim. That's an enormous amount of seed that would be planted in this area. Even a gigantic area, if it's enclosed and you throw from a public domain into this area, chayav. You carry it from a public to a private domain. Okay, because you put something from the public to the private domain. So even though it's not enclosed for it's not private in the way that we think. It could be like a flea market or something, indoors. Okay, it's an indoor market. So it's really very public. It's not for dira, it's not for living. It's really people are going in there for other purposes, but it's enclosed.
You would be chayav if you threw from public to public. So this is assuming that it's less than 4 amot.
Less than 4 amot, right? Yeah. You threw it over the wall. So you might say, well, it's not, so my ta'ama mechitzahi ela shemechuseret diurin. That what's the reason? Because it has a mechitza, but it's lacking dwelling. In other words, midirabanan, rabbinically, these areas that are enclosed, but they're not enclosed ladira. They're not enclosed for living purposes. They're enclosed for other purposes, like to make a storehouse or for whatever. So in these cases, rabbinically we treat it as a public domain. We don't treat, or a carmelit. We don't treat it as a private domain because it's not enclosed for private living.
It's not in private.
Right. So what Ula was saying over there was that the reason is that you have to always look at two different frameworks. In the biblical framework, any place that's enclosed, basically it's a private domain. But rabbinically, if it's enclosed not for living, but for something else, like in this case for storage or for whatever other purpose one might enclose this area, for planting inside, it's considered a carmelit rabbinically. Okay, so that would be our case because this plain, according to Rav Ashi here, this plain is enclosed because it's a field. It's an enclosed field. So do we consider an enclosed field a Reshut Yachid? Basically what he's saying is even an enclosed field that's fenced, you wouldn't be able to carry in there rabbinically because it's not enclosed for dwelling.
But in the case of throwing from public to private,
it would still be a Reshut Yachid.
Right,
biblically.
That would make the biblical
lower.
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah. It's a funny situation.
Exactly.
That's exactly why Ula is saying that because you might think, I can,
you think you're more stringent,
right?
But then you're making
you're actually making it seem like it's less,
more lenient,
right? Because really, it's a Reshut Yachid. You're right. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Right.
So it's a very good point. Yeah, and it's somewhat problematic, but yeah, it does happen sometimes. I can think of many cases, but I don't want to get too far off. We understand why Rav Ashi didn't say like Ula. Because he didn't want to say that the word Reshut Yachid isn't meant literally. He wanted to show that no, there's a case where the plain really is biblically a Reshut Yachid. It's a private domain. But Ula himself was the author of the teaching that spoke about a place that would otherwise be a Reshut Yachid because it's enclosed, but it's treated as a Karmelit. It's treated rabbinically as if it were not a private domain. So why can't he apply the same thing here and say that, when the Mishnah said that it was a Reshut Yachid, a private domain, that was from a biblical standpoint. And when it said in the Baraita that it was a Karmelit, that's talking about either a case where it isn't enclosed, or that's talking about a case where it's talking about rabbinically, that we treat it like a Karmelit, one or the other. So what's the answer? Amar lach, he said, that if it were an enclosed area, it wouldn't be called the bik'ah. We have a term for an enclosed area that's enclosed not for living purposes. Okay, it's karpef. That's the term. No, it's just saying that when we talk about this, we have a term for it. Okay. There's a term for it. We would have used the right term. Why would we call it a bik'ah? A plain is an open area. So he doesn't think that the word bik'ah means an enclosed area. It means an open area. So he doesn't. That's why he doesn't want to use that idea. Rav Ashi reshut yachid kataneh. And of course, Rav Ashi his rejoinder is, but it says reshut yachid. It says private domain, and according to you, it's not a private domain because it's wide open, and it's really a karmelit. So the point is that one way or another, the semantics don't work out that well. If you look at the word bik'ah, plain, bik'ah doesn't really sound like it means an open area. So Rav Ashi is introducing a piece of information here that really it's an enclosed area. That's a chidush. Okay. Ula doesn't want to accept that. Ula's view is that the word Reshut HaYachid here, private domain, doesn't really mean private domain. It really means karmelit. It really means it's not a public domain. Because it's not made for people to pass through. Okay? But he says that the word Reshut HaYachid is not being used literally here. So either one, whether you go with Rav Ashi, is going to say that the word bik'ah is not literal because it's actually enclosed, and according to Ula, it's going to be that the word Reshut HaYachid, the word private domain, is not literal. It just means that it's not public because he doesn't want to believe that the case is a case of an enclosed plain. So that's why they come out with two different interpretations of how to work out how to resolve this. According to Ula, the resolution is that it doesn't mean that a plain is ever really a private domain. Both are talking about the same case, a wide open area. Just that one is saying it's a karmelit, which is correct, halachically correct, and the other one is using the term private domain, not precisely, imprecisely. Okay, as if to mean not a public domain. Rav Ashi says no, it's being precise with regard to the categories. So when it said karmelit, it meant an unenclosed plain, and when it said Reshut HaYachid, it means an enclosed one.
I mean, it's also possible that it can be treated as a karmelit in one situation and a private domain in another situation.
Well, like in the Karpef case is the case that he's bringing.
Right.
Where you see that it's treated as a karmelit basically, even though it's a Reshut HaYachid. Right, so that's what he's trying to say. So he says, but then the word bik'ah doesn't fit so well because why would we use a term for a wide open place to mean it's not really a wide open place? So that's the problem. So either way, it's not precise in the language. About karmelit. So in the last one in the list that I mentioned before, it mentioned the ocean, it mentioned the plain, it mentioned the area the area where the sellers would hang their wares in the market, and then it mentions the karmelit. But the karmelit is the category. It's not another case. It's not another example. And that's exactly what the Gemara says. That aren't they all examples of karmelit? So why is karmelit an example itself? Karmelit is the category. That would be like saying that the examples of a private domain are a house, an apartment, a classroom, and a private domain. No, it isn't. A private domain is not an example. It's a category. So why does it mention karmelit? Ki ata Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan. Rav Dimi said that Rav Yochanan said when he came to visit from Israel, he brought information. Lo netzuchel lekeren zavit asmucha leReshut harabim. Dafal gav dezim niddacha kebe rabim va'ilei legava kevan dela nichat hashmishte ki karmelit tameh. What it's talking about is like this: that you can have a situation where houses border the public domain. And you can have a situation, one of two possibilities Rashi brings. One that Rashi brings is that there's a line of houses basically at the edge of the public domain, and one of them is pushed back a little bit and leaves some property for the Reshut HaRabim. So therefore there's sort of like a nook that you could go into from the Reshut HaRabim, but it's not easy to access. It's like a little alley there that you could go into, or a little cul-de-sac or something, off of the Reshut HaRabim, off of the public domain. So it really would be an extension of the public domain, but the problem is that it's not easily accessible to people who are passing because you have to go in to this little alcove type of area. The other example that Rashi gives is that maybe a house is fitting its edge, is jutting into the public domain. So there's an area, it sort of creates a little alcove from jutting in. It creates a little area that's set off from the rest of the public domain that you have to go around the house to get into, because it's jutting in. Either way, the point is that you can have something which is contiguous with the public domain, but there's something blocking people from easily accessing it. That becomes a karmelit, because it loses the feature of being accessible and open to the public. So once it loses that feature, it's karmelit. It gets demoted to karmelit. Kiyata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi said, when he came from Israel, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said the following, that Ben Amudim Nidon Ke Karmelit. Between the Amudim, what this means is the Amudim was where they would hang their wares. Whatever they were selling in the market, they would hang it from there. So between these different poles or these different pillars that they had things hanging from, that's the karmelit, because my time afal gav didarsei barabim kevad delo mistagelahu behedya ki karmelit damya. Apparently there was a thoroughfare area of the market, and then there's an area of the market where there are all different things hung up, and all different amudim, all different pillars and displays are up. Okay, so in that area you can't walk straight through, because one guy's placed here, one guy's placed here. It's like a little maze. You have to walk around, and it's not easy to get through. So it's not an easy thoroughfare to pass through. So because of that, it's a karmelit. Now this is another example of a Gemara where those who try to justify the Eruvin, the modern Eruv, will take from this and say, nowadays we don't have a straight, what's called mifulash. We don't have a straight passageway through our Reshut HaRabim. There's all kinds of twists and turns. Okay? So therefore it's similar to the Amudim. Now it's obviously a little bit of a stretch to say that roads that twist and turn are the same as an area that has a whole bunch of different stands put up in a random order that you can't get through. But but they try to bring that as an example.
They use the rotaries in Washington as the excuse.
Oh, do they?
Circles.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. The roundabouts or whatever they're called. Yeah.
But in Potomac.
Whatever. They always find a reason. Where there's a will, there's a way when it comes to that. So okay. So Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Yehuda said, "Itztabash lefnei amudim," the place where the shopkeeper sits, basically. Nidon ke karmelit. That's definitely a karmelit, because he has a little place that he sits there with his cash register or whatever, and it's definitely an obstruction. That little area where he sits, that's definitely not Reshut HaRabim. But so he says that's liman damar ben amudim kol shekin itztabah. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan's teaching before, that even between the pillars, in other words, in that area where the wares are being displayed, that's also a karmelit. So according to that, certainly the place where the shopkeeper sits is not public. However, but according to the second opinion of Rabbi Zera, that the place where the shopkeeper sits is not a public domain, but he would say actually that the place with all the wares being displayed is a public domain. So there is a machloket here. Everybody agrees where the shopkeeper sits, that little place where he sits is a karmelit. It's not a Reshut HaRabim. It's a separate area, but the area where the wares are being displayed, there's a machloket. And actually here you have a machloket rishonim in how we hold. According to the Rambam, we hold the stringent view, the second view, and therefore all those arguments from the twisting and turning wouldn't be valid according to him. Lishnach harina, there's another version here of the discussion. Aval ben amudim dezimnin didarsele rabim kereshut harabim damya. That according to that, it doesn't say that the nichat tashmishtei, that the factor that makes in between the pillars more of a public area is not because nichat tashmishtei, because it's easy to get through, but since people sometimes pass through there when they have to. When the thoroughfare is blocked, they'll go through the area of the amudim. So normally they won't go through the area where the wares are being displayed because it's harder to get through there. It's not an easy passage. But sometimes, you'll do it. I remember when we were in Disney World, in summer, and the parade came. You know when they have the parades in the parks, and then you can't walk on the sidewalk. So what do? You walk through. You have no way to get through. So sometimes that happens.
But didn't we justify just before we were talking about the regular open space and the cul-de-sac?
Right.
That is a carmel.
It's a carmelit because it's not easily accessible.
Right. So this sounds like the same kind of thing. What am I missing?
It seems like it's easily accessible is different here.
More easily accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is that there you actually, because of the way the cul-de-sac is structured, you kind of have to turn off of the passage of the public domain to get there. Here, I think the problem is that it's not that you can't go through the area. It's just that it's a twisting and turning to go. So it's not like you're right. It's just more complicated. It's not that you have to go off of the path to get there. See, so it's just that the path itself is twisting and turning. I mean, I think that's the difference. Yeah. So Amar Rabba Bar Shela, Amar Rav Chisda, Rabba Bar Shela said that Rav Chisda said Levena zekufa b'rshut harabim v'zarak v'tach b'fanea chayav. These are all the somehow Jews never made it in sports, but we have all these great cases of throwing and landing in the most precise areas. So somebody throws an object and it sticks to a brick. The brick is standing up in the public domain, and the person throws it, and it's standing 3 tfachim tall, because that was the standard size of bricks, Rashi says. So it lands on there. So he says, if that happens, hayav. If it lands on the side of the brick, so the brick is standing like this, okay? The brick is standing vertically. It comes on the side of the brick. Hayav. That person is... we're assuming that he threw this 4 amot in a Reshut HaRabim. It's considered to have landed in the public domain. If it lands on top of the brick, however, so now it's elevated 3 tfachim over the public domain,
right.
And that area on top of the brick is not considered part of the public domain because it's not a place where somebody would step, because it's standing 3 tfachim up above the public domain. So that's the reason why we would say patur in that case, because people would not step over that, and therefore al gaba patur.
I thought it was 10 tefachim.
Not for this.
Between 3 and 10.
No, anything between 3 and 10.
Right.
So here we're talking about the minimum. So the minimum is 3 tefachim off the ground. If it lands 3 tefachim off the ground, that's not considered part of the public domain because it's too high. Anything over 3 up to 10 is not the public domain, because it's not something that somebody would step over.
Okay, I had it in my head.
Yeah. So Abaye v'Ravad Amar Tarvayu v'Oshe Gavoa Shelosha Lo Darsei LaRabim. That this is only true if it's 3 tefachim high, this brick, because that's somebody won't step over 3 tefachim high brick.
Right.
Okay, a lower one maybe they'll step over it, from time to time. But something 3 tefachim, they're not going to step over it. But if you had like bushes or thorny stuff, so then even if it's not 3 tefachim, it's not considered part of the public domain. So if you were to throw something dalit amot, 4 amot in the public domain, and it would land in a thorn bush, even if the thorn bush is a low bush, nobody's going to stand on a bush because they're going to get thorns and it's not going to be comfortable. So that's not considered part of the public domain. So if you look outside and they have areas where there are bushes or whatever, so if you were to throw something, it would land on the bush. That wouldn't be considered part of the public domain, presuming that it is between 3 and 10. I'm sorry, not 3. Even if it's less than 3 tefachim tall, up to 10 tefachim. Because once you get to 10 tefachim, you deal with an issue of it creating its own area, as we're going to see. We're going to see that soon. So I disagree. Even bushes are part of the public domain, because somebody who's wearing shoes might walk over them, as we would do from time to time. But if there's excrement, we know we don't want to step on that. No matter what you're wearing, you definitely want to step on that. So if the thing that you threw landed there, then it wouldn't be considered part of the public domain, because it's not a place where people would step. Even if it's excrement, if it's in the public domain, and it's not distinct by being 3 tefachim off the ground, then it's considered part of the public domain. And that is the halacha, that even if something is, that anything lower then 3 tefachim is still considered part of the public domain. Anything higher, between 3 and 10 tefachim, is considered not part of the public domain. So therefore, it could be what's called a makom patur, which we're going to see in a second. Makom patur is an area which is nothing. It's completely nothing. Or it could be a karmelit. A karmelit is if it has dimensions of 4 by 4 tefachim in width and length.
So wait a minute.
And the height is between 3 and 10 tefachim. You'll have what's called a karmelit.
But the 3 tefachim, the 3 tefachim, that's regardless of whether it's 4 by 4.
That's regardless of whether it's 4 by 4. That it won't be part of the Rishut
So it
HaRabim.
could be like an entire. Because it could be, I don't know, like.
No, if it's 4 by 4, then it's going to be a karmelit already. I thought you meant it could be less. In other words,
no, more.
3 tefachim off the ground is to make it not Rishut HaRabim.
Right, but if it's more.
Now the question is, what are the dimensions of that thing that's not Rishut HaRabim? If it's 10 tefachim high, and it's 4 by 4, it's a Rishut HaYachid. It's a private domain already. If it's 4 by 4 tefachim and it's less than 10 tefachim tall, so it's a karmelit then. Okay, and if it's less than 4 by 4 tefachim in its width and length, then it will be a makom patur. A makom patur is a place that's nothing. And that's what you look for. If you realize you have something in your pocket that you didn't mean to carry and there's no eruv, you look for a makom patur to put it on. Because that's it. And that would be something which is between 3 and 9 tefachim off the ground, and less than 4 by 4 tefachim in its dimensions. Okay, that's a place that's makom patur. It doesn't fall into any category. Right. As we're going to see more.
But we're still in the patur category, not in the mutar category.
Right. Well, makom patur is actually totally allowed.
So
it's totally allowed. That's fine. So we're going to see more about it. We're not really up to that yet. So, but this is the halacha so far. So now, Amar Rabba Devei Rav Shila, Rabba from the yeshiva of Rav Shila said, Ki ata Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Ein karmelit pechuta me'arba'ah. That there's no karmelit less than 4 by 4 tefachim. In other words, karmelit is a reshut. It is a domain. It requires dimensions. So it has to be 4 by 4 tefachim. Okay, it has to be a minimum of 4 by 4 tefachim. And then he said, Va'amar Rav Sheshet, and Rav Sheshet said, V'tofeset ad asara, and it grabs up to 10. What does it mean? We're going to see. My v'tofeset ad asara. What do you mean it grabs up to 10? If you're going to tell me that you require a wall of 10 tefachim to make a karmelit, so a lot of things that we think of as a karmelit wouldn't be counting then, because you're saying you need a wall of 10 tefachim? No, couldn't be. Because V'lo, v'ha'amar Rav Gidal amar Rav Chia bar Yosef, amar Rav Gidal said that Rav Chia bar Yosef said that Rav said, Bayit she'en b'tocho asara, v'keruyo mashli'mo la'asara. Let's say you have a house which is only 9 tefachim inside. That's a very low ceiling. But let's say you did. And the roof is a thickness of 1 tefach. So inside there's only 9 tefachim of height. But if on top of the roof, you're on top of 10 tefachim. Right? Because it's from the outside, if you look at the house, it's 10 tefachim tall. But inside, there's only 9 tefachim of airspace. Okay? So what do you do then? So he says, inside, it's a karmelit. You can't carry more than 4 amot. It's a karmelit. Okay? So on top of it, though, right? So he says, al gago mutar l'taltel b'chulo b'tocho in metaltelin bo l'daled amot. So on top of it, you're on. Since we have a rule that if you're on top of a reshut hayachid, like on top of the roof, it's good. You can carry up there, even though the roof itself is not enclosed. It's okay. But downstairs, inside the actual house, you can't carry inside there. But on top of the roof, since you're on top of the reshut hayachid, you're good. Okay. So he said, but inside you can't. So that shows you that the karmelit has only 9 tefachim in there. There are only 9 tefachim in the airspace. And yet you're allowed to, it's considered a karmelit. So when it says it grabs up to 10, it can't mean that it requires 10 tefachim of height, the karmelit, because obviously it doesn't require 10 tefachim of height. Okay, so therefore what does it mean? What it means is that if you're in a karmelit, the status of karmelit only extends up to 10 tefachim. So if you're in a place which is a karmelit, and you're above the ground, you're above 10 tefachim, or you're passing something above 10 tefachim, the karmelit doesn't apply to that. That is a neutral zone. It's a makom patur. It's a neutral zone. Okay, so that's the way that it's looked at. So v'chihad amar le Shmuel le Rav Yehuda, like what Rav Yehuda said to Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, Shinena, you're a sharp one. Okay, he always called him sharp one. Shmuel always called Rav Yehuda, meaning you're smart. Lo tevei b'milei de Shabbat lemala miyud. In the matters of Shabbat, it's not over 10. What does that mean? He said cryptic things. That's why, but that was because he was so smart. He could figure out what he was talking about. What's he talking about? If you mean that Reshut Yachid, a private domain, doesn't extend past 10 tefachim. Fa'amar Rav Chisda, not kadar Reshut Yachid, z'rak v'nachal gabav, afilu gavo mea ama chayav, mesh Reshut Yachid ole ad l'rakia. But Rav Chisda said that if you stick some kind of a kaneh is like if you put a stick, basically, some kind of a stick, a pole. That's a good term. Yeah. If you stick a pole in the private domain, so you're in an enclosed area, and you put a pole that's 100 tvachim high or 100 amot high. Okay. He says if you throw something from the public domain and it lands on that, you still are considered to have carried from a public to a private domain because the private domain goes ad la rakia. It goes to the heavens. If you're over the private domain goes up infinitely. There's no limit. Okay, so now we turn to Amud Bet Eladein Reshut Harabim L'Mala Miyud. Maybe what he meant was that the Reshut Harabim, the status of public domain, doesn't extend higher than 10 tefachim. So, for example, let's say you are in your house, and you throw something from your window and it lands in the tree above the public domain. You're on the second floor of the house. Okay? It's way above 10 tefachim. So you're not considered to have gone from a private to a public domain because the public domain doesn't extend that high. It doesn't extend up to 10 tefachim. Past 10 tefachim, rather. Now we're going to find out that throwing above 10 tefachim might be a problem and passing might be a problem too. Carrying wouldn't be a problem though, for sure. Okay? Right, you could stand on the tree and walk around carrying stuff in your treehouse if you're like Swiss Family Robinson or something like that. It would be okay. Now, it couldn't be that Rav Yehuda was being taught that the Reshut HaRabim doesn't extend past 10 tefachim. Why? Because matnitini, because it's in a Mishnah. Titznan hazorek dal adamot bakotel lemala miyud tefachim kizorek ba'avir lemala miyud tefachim kizorek ba'aretz. Because we said already that somebody who throws 4 amot and it lands on a wall. If it lands on the wall above 10 tefachim, it's like you threw it in the air. Okay, meaning above 10 tefachim. If it landed on the wall at a point you're standing on the ground, you threw something and it lands on a wall of the Reshut HaRabim, of the public domain we're talking about. Still in the public domain, but it lands 10 tefachim above the public domain. It's kizorek ba'avir. It's like you threw it in the air. Meaning, it's not considered to have landed. You didn't carry something in the public domain then. Okay? However, if it lands less than 10 tefachim, then it's like you transported it within the public domain for amot. So in other words, here's another trick. If you're carrying something, you put it above 10 tefachim, that's not considered Reshut HaRabim. That's not part of the public domain because it's not an area that's easily accessible to the people who are passing in the public domain. That's the reason. Now, so Ella Carmelite. So what must he have been talking about? Since it couldn't be that Shmuel was telling Rav Yehuda that the public domain extends only up to 10 tefachim because we know that already from a Mishnah. So what was he telling him? He must have been talking about the Carmelite. Zain Carmelite lemala miyud, that above 10 tefachim, the status of Carmelite doesn't apply. Here's the point. That the rabbis were lenient with the Carmelite as treating it in certain ways like a private domain and in certain ways as a public domain. Why? So, because what's a leniency that they applied based on a Reshut Yachid? Just like a private domain has to be at least 4x4 tefachim to qualify as a private domain, and anything less than 4x4 tefachim is not a private domain, so too with a Carmelite. Anything less than 4x4 tefachim is considered a makom patur. It doesn't reach the level of Carmelite. That's a leniency. And on the other hand, mikule Reshut HaRabim, that yud tefachim hu dahavya Carmelite, l'mal yud tefachim lo havya Carmelite, that up to 10 tefachim is considered a Carmelite, but not past 10 tefachim, just like a Reshut HaRabim. So rather than take the stringency of the private domain and say that it extends infinitely, that if you're on top of a skyscraper, you're on top of the Empire State Building, and you're standing up there, it's still a Reshut Yachid. It doesn't matter that you're way, way up high, because the Reshut Yachid that is under you extends, to the Rakia. It extends infinitely. But the public domain only goes up to 10 tefachim. So too with the Carmelite, it only goes up to 10 tefachim. So that's the leniency drawn from the Reshut Rabim. Kufa, we go back to what we said before. Amar Rav Gidal, Amar Rav Chia Bar Yosef, Amar Rav. Rav Gidal said that Rav Chia Bar Yosef said that Rav said, Bayit she'en tocho yud. If you have a house that doesn't have 10 tefachim of airspace inside, v'keruyo mashlimo liyud, but counting the roof, like we said before, the roof is a tefachai. So if you're walking on the roof, there's 10 tefachim under you. If you look from the outside, there's 10 tefachim in the house, but inside there's only 9 tefachim in the room. So, al gago mutal taltel bekulo, betocho en metaltalin boil bedaladamot. So we said that on the roof you can walk around and carry because it's a private domain, because you're on top of the 10 tefachim tall private domain. But inside, it's only 9 tefachim, it's going to be a Carmelite. So you're going to have a problem. So Amar Abai said, Ve'im chakak bo dalid al dalid ve'shlimo leyud mutar letaltel bekulo. Abai has a nice chidush here. He says, what do you do then? There's a trick. You know what you do? Go into this area, go into this house. They had dirt floors, right? Dig 1 tefach more thick, an area of 4 by 4 tefachim. Square in the middle of the house. Now you have a Reshut Yachid. Why? Because in that area, if you stand in that area that you just made, that you dug an extra tefach, it's 4 by 4 tefachim, right? So it qualifies as a private domain. And above you is a roof, and around you is 4 walls, right? So it's a private domain in that area, right? So you can stand in that area, and he takes it further. It's not just that you can only carry in that little 4 by 4 area, because now mutar letaltel bekulo. If you did that, now you can carry anywhere. Why? Because because any holes, so to speak, holes in the private domain are considered like the private domain. In other words, any extension of the private domain is like the private domain itself. So you created a private domain, that 4 by 4 area, and now what do we look at the areas of the house that are only 9 tefachim tall, the rest of the house? We just look at that as an extension of the main area. Okay, because it's there for the use of the person in the Reshut Yachid, so no problem. So now you create a Reshut Yachid. Now the Tosafot points out here, very interesting, that because it actually reminded me of it right away, and then I looked and Tosafot mentioned it and deals with the problem of Sukkah. You have a similar case in Sukkah, where you have, if your Sukkah is too low, it's less than 10 tefachim, so what do? It says you make a, in the middle, you have to make a little pit or something that's 1 tefach deep, but there, it has to be within a certain distance from the walls. Okay, it has to be within a certain distance of the walls. So if it's not within a certain distance of the walls, in other words, if you have a huge sukkah and the only part of it that's that's 10 tefachim tall is the part in the center, that's not good. It has to be within 3 tefachim of the sides in order for it to count. So and that's what he mentions. Why does that rule not apply here? That it has to be within 3 tefachim of the walls. Abaye doesn't say that. So he makes a very interesting distinction, and you see the analytic approach of the Tosafot, because he says in Sukkah the idea is that the walls have to be under the sechach. So it has to be as if the walls really are close to that area. It can't be that the area of living, that 4 by 4 amot, the 4 by 4 tefachim is not is not contiguous with or connected to the walls. Okay, but when it comes to the house, the rule of Reshut Yachid is just that it has to be enclosed. It just has to be enclosed. So the fact that it's enclosed, even if the enclosure is distant from the area that's the 10 tefachim tall, it's not a problem. So that's the way that it deals.
What's the problem that Abai is trying to do? Why make a private domain inside a private domain?
If you wanted to, no, it's not a private domain because it was only 9 tefachim tall. So now what did you do? You made the part of the house that was the dimensions.
The house is private domain already?
No, it's not, because it's only Carmelite, because it's only 9 tefachim tall.
Gotcha.
So that's why you made it deep.
So
you don't have to make the chidush of Abaye is you don't have to make the entire thing a tefach deeper.
Okay.
Just one area that's 4 by 4 is enough to qualify for it to be deep enough. Okay, so now we come to a question though. As we said, because everybody agrees that if you have something which is a which is secondary, which is an extension of the main area, so it's definitely considered, with a private domain, it's considered part of the private domain. What about Reshut HaRabim? Chorei Reshut HaRabim, Apaye Omer Kereshut HaRabim Damu, Rava Ama Omer Lav Kereshut HaRabim Damu. That according to Abaye, the same principle applies in a Reshut HaRabim. Let's say, for example, there's a wall in a public area. It's not enclosed, but there's a wall there, and the wall has holes in it. So would you call, let's say, the holes in the wall an extension of the public domain, such that if I threw something and it landed in that hole, it would be considered that it landed in the public domain, or not? That's the question. Abaye says yes, Rava says no. Amar le Rava la Abaye, Rava said to Abaye, ledidach damrat korei Reshut HaRabim Kereshut HaRabim damu. According to you, if there's a hole in the wall in the public domain, it's considered part of the public domain. You're going to have a problem with the statement that Rav Dimi brought from Israel in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that we learned before. Because remember the story or the case of the house that's set back from the public domain and leaves a little bit of area in the public domain, or that it cuts off part of the public domain, it sections it off by protruding into the public area, and it makes a little cul-de-sac area there. So what do we do with that? We said that it's considered a Carmelit. But according to you, something that's an extension, that's contiguous with the Reshut HaRabim, should still be the Reshut HaRabim. Because according to you, once you have Reshut HaRabim, that extends to whatever is contiguous with it. So why would that not apply in the case of Rabbi Yochanan too? Why is he saying that this area, which is for all practical purposes contiguous with the Reshut HaRabim, is not going to be Reshut HaRabim? So he says, the answer is Hatam la nichatash mishtei. So Abaye has an answer. He says that's not a good comparison, because over there, the fact that the house is angled the way that it is, or the cul-de-sac is placed the way that it is, it's not easy to get to it. Right? That's what we said. But if I'm walking down and I want somewhere to rest my bag or rest whatever I'm carrying, this hole in the wall right here is perfect.
But in reality, it has two different status depending on whether you live in that area or whether you're passing through. If you're passing through from the outside, then it's a public. It's public.
I mean the wall.
The wall, inside the wall, right? But if you live inside,
the other side is it right? That's true. That's true. The other side, but the wall itself, right? That's true. So the wall itself, it could be that it's not even part of a private domain, because it could just be a wall, a ruin, or whatever. We don't know. But the point is that the cul-de-sac is not useful because you have to get off the path to get there. Here we're talking about a wall along the side. You want to put something down, you put it down in the hole in the wall. People would do that all the time. So that's why there's a difference. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah. Hazorek dalet amot bakotel lemala miyud kizorek ba'avir lemata miyud kizvachim kizorek ba'aretz. So we said before, we actually mentioned this before, that if you throw something 4 amot and it lands on a wall, if it's above 10 tfachim, that where it lands, no problem. You didn't carry 4 amot in the public domain, because above 10 tfachim is not public domain anymore. Under 10 tfachim, it's public domain. So what did he say? When we asked the following question, Mike, kizorek ba'aretz, why are you saying that if it falls under 10 tfachim, it's like you threw it on the ground? Valonach, it didn't come to rest. In other words, you threw it against the wall. So why are you saying that if it didn't come to rest, it didn't land? So why are you saying it's like you threw it on the ground? So he says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, we're talking about somebody who threw a sticky date. Right. The sticky date adheres to the wall, or whatever. It could be anything, but the point is, you threw something that adheres to the wall. That has to be what it's talking about. So because it adheres to the wall within 10 tfachim, it comes to rest on the wall. And as Tosafot mentions, we know this principle that things have to land on an area of 4 by 4 tfachim. We learned that before. So even if it's vertical, we still say it's still 4 by 4 tfachim there. It's just that it's vertical. It's on the wall. So that's why it's okay.
The example of the wall they brought, it was a wall on
that's another one. That's right. That's the other one. That's the roof. Yeah. So that's what he said. So now they asked the following question against Abaye. But according to you, Abaye, you said that holes in the wall are part of the Reshut HaRabim. So why did Rabbi Yochanan have to give a case with a sticky date sticking to the wall? Why didn't he just say he threw it and it landed in the wall, in the hole in the wall?
Right.
So zimnin mishanila shanitrod v'chayfetz mihad. So sometimes when they would have this argument, apparently Abaye and Rava had very interesting Shabbat dinners. They would be arguing about all this. Sometimes Abaye's answer would be, well, the reason why he picked the sticky date was because if you throw a rock against the wall, it's going to bounce back. Even if there's a hole in the wall, it's going to bounce back. So it's not a good case. Okay, zimnin mishanila b'kota deleit bechor, or maybe we're talking about a wall that didn't have any holes in it. It was very well maintained. They had good wall maintenance, and they didn't have any holes. So where will I get the idea that there are no holes in this wall? Midikatane resha, because it says in the beginning, zarak lemala miyud tfachim kizorek ba'avir, because we said in the beginning that if you threw it over 10 tfachim, it's like you threw it in the air. And if we're talking about a wall that had a hole, why would they say it's like you threw it in the air? No, it landed in the hole. So it's not suspended in the air. The best case of suspended in the air is a date that sticks to the wall. So maybe you're going to tell me that we're talking about a hole that was less than 4 by 4 tfachim, and that's what it landed in. Rabbi Yehuda said that Rabbi Chia said that that if you threw something above 10 tfachim and it landed in a hole that was tiny, even the tiniest size hole, banu lemachloket Rabbi Meir v'Rabbanan. To Rabbi Meir savar chokikin lahashlim, v'Rabbanan savar ein chokikin lahashlim. That if it falls into a wall, now the problem here is that it could be that you'll have an issue of even a reshut hayachid here, because if this wall is 10 tfachim high and there's an area of 4 by 4 tfachim in this wall that the rock fell into, then it basically fell into a private domain, because you have a wall of 10 tfachim tall and you have an area inside it that's 4 by 4 tfachim. The wall itself is like a reshut hayachid now. It's a private domain. It creates its own domain. So it can't be that we're talking about that kind of hole in the wall. So in other words, above 10 tfachim, you have a different problem, Abaye is saying, which is if there's a hole in the wall, if the hole in the wall is 4 by 4 tfachim, then it's a private domain, and he couldn't exempt you. If the hole in the wall is less than 4 by 4 tfachim, you still have a problem, because banu lemachloket Rabbi Meir v'Rabbanan. What is the machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim? They talk about a case where you have a doorway that doesn't meet the dimensions of a mezuzah, like a kippah, it's called. It's curved like this. So according to Rabbi Meir, chokikin lahashlim, which means as long as there's enough in that wall that you could carve out a doorway of the right dimensions, it's good enough. According to the rabbis, no. Unless the doorway is actually cut out to the right dimensions, it's not a doorway. Okay? Yeah. So what is the point here? So the point here is that according to Rabbi Meir, we follow the rabbis. It has to actually be cut. But the point is that if Rabbi Meir, if the stone fell into even a small hole in the wall above 10 tfachim, according to Rabbi Meir, because we have the principle of chokikin lahashlim, since it could be carved out 4 by 4, even though it's not now, but since that wall is thick enough that we could carve it out, a 4 by 4, so therefore it's considered a private domain. Okay, so so we would have a machloket of Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanan. Therefore, Abaye says it's easier to say that there's no hole in this wall, because above 10 tfachim you're going to have a problem if you say that it landed in a hole in the wall. Because you're going to have to say either it could have fallen into a reshut hayachid, or at least it will be a machloket if it fell into a reshut hayachid. In that case, you're going to have a lot of difficulty. So therefore, he prefers to say that we're talking about a case where shema mina elalav shema mina bakota deleit bechor, that we're talking about a wall that does not have a hole in it, shema mina, and this is the conclusion. So Abaye says that's why Rabbi Yochanan came along with his case of the sticky date, because if we're talking about a rock or another object, it's going to have to land in a hole in the wall. Once you bring a hole in the wall, you're going to have different problems, such as you're going to have a problem with above 10 tfachim, distinguishing between that and a case where something lands in a private domain.
Right. Is it 4 by 4 in the hole in the wall this way?